I think Korean entrepreneurs want everything to be perfect before they start, before they put their product out there. You know, there is a saying in the startup community, fail fast and fail often. Why? Because that's how you learn. That's how you get better. That's how your startup.
네, 이번 시간에는 또 핀테크 그리고 크립토 분야에서 전문성을 갖춘 전문가를 모셔서 제가 미국에 왔습니다. 그래서 이야기를 해보도록 하겠습니다. 반갑습니다. 예, 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요.
자기소개 부탁드리겠습니다.
I'm Douglas Park. I'm a corporate and securities lawyer in Silicon Valley. I work primarily with startup companies of all different types. And before that, I used to be a business professor.
그러면 혹시 이제 한국 분이시잖아요. 여기 미국에는 언제쯤 오셨었는지?
I was born in America. And my parents came from Korea. So yes, I was born in America.
그 하버드 앤 스탠퍼드에서 수학을 하시고 홍콩 과학기술대학교에서 교수로도 재직을 하셨었고, 근데 이제 어떻게 이게 핀테크랑 크립토 분야에서 이렇게 또 전문성을 갖춘 변호사의 길을 가시게 됐는지 여쭤보도록 하겠습니다.
After I finished at Harvard, I wanted to be a business professor, so I went to Stanford Business School. And then I was a professor in Hong Kong at a business school at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. But business and law cannot be separated. They are one. So I wanted to learn the legal side. That's why I decided to become a lawyer.
저는 이 하버드랑 스탠퍼드를 둘 다 이렇게 나온 분을 처음 보는 것 같은데, 둘 중에 혹시 어떤 게 더 어려우셨는지 좀 여쭤볼 수 있을까요?
Well, you know, they're both very great schools, right? And I liked both Harvard and Stanford. You just have to focus and study hard, but also you need to take advantage of all of the other students and professors and everything else that the university offers.
저 뭐 한국 사람 입장에서는 신기한 게 수학을 메이저로 한 다음에 변호사가 되는 케이스를 한국에서는 잘 못 봤는데, 미국에서는 수학을 전공해서 이제 변호사가 되면은 왜 그렇게 했고 이제 어떤 활동들 할 수 있는지 좀 궁금했었거든요.
I like learning. I like working with companies. I like working with entrepreneurs. I love entrepreneurs and I love startups. They're so exciting to me because I like seeing things and doing things that are new and different. And that is what startups and entrepreneurs do.
실리콘밸리에 오랫동안 계셨었잖아요. 그러면은 뭐 대략 언제쯤부터 실리콘밸리에서 활동하셨는지 좀 들어볼 수 있을까요?
Total almost 30 years, including my time at Stanford. And then I moved back after law school. I went to University of Michigan Law School. And I moved back to Silicon Valley. And I've been here for 20 years in Silicon Valley practicing law, but also helping my clients on the business side and the strategy side, which I think is very helpful to them. And the entrepreneurs that I work with really like that I can help them on the legal side and the business side.
실리콘밸리 어떻게 1세대라고 해야 되는데, 그때 초창기 때 실리콘밸리 계셨던 분으로서 그때 여기 실리콘밸리가 뭐 어떤 분위기였고 뭐 얼마나 기업들이 있었는지 좀 여쭤볼 수 있을까요?
Very different from now. Back then there was a lot of farmland around here. Not all of these buildings like Apple and Google and Meta. No, that it wasn't like that. But there was venture capital, a lot of money to invest in startup companies. So at the beginning, I think Silicon Valley was really known for software companies. Also, you know, chip companies, semiconductor chips.
기억에 남았던 기업의 좀 성장 스토리가 좀 기억나는 기업은 어떤 게 있는지.
When I came to Stanford, I did not plan on working with startups, but I met two entrepreneurs who were trying to build software related to patents. And at that time, no one had ever thought about doing that. It was a completely new idea, and it was very exciting to me. So they asked me to help them with something, and I said yes.
한국 좀 투자 시장과 미국 투자 시장이 좀 어떻게 다르다라고 좀 이야기해 줄 수 있는지 여쭤보도록
I
하겠습니다.
think the biggest difference is that American investors are more willing to take a risk in their investments. And that's why the venture capital community, even the angel investment community, has grown so strong in America. But at the same time, I think Korea is getting much better. There are more venture capital funds, there's more investment in startups, and even the Korean government is encouraging more people to become entrepreneurs and is encouraging investment in startups.
거기에 이제 사람들 차이도 좀 어떤 느낌이 있는지 좀 궁금하거든요.
So I think it's the same thing that I mentioned about Korean and American investors. I think that American entrepreneurs are more willing to take a risk. They're willing to quit their job, even a very good job at a big company, and start a new company because they find something that they are excited about and they want to be their own boss. So I think that that culture is much more developed in America right now, at least, than in Korea.
한국 사람 관점에서는 이게 조금은 이해하기 어려울 수도 있는 게 이게 그 리스크를 다 떠안게 됐다. 예를 들어 사업에 실패하거나 이렇게 되면은 나 앞으로 뭐 해 먹고 살지? 이런 고민도 있을 수 있는데 여기 사람들은 이렇게 계속 도전 정신이 나오는 그 원천이 뭔지 좀 궁금했었거든요.
I think that kind of idea has been in America for a long time, even going back to the time in the 1800s of the wild, wild West, where people came out to California, for instance, to try to find gold. They would leave their families far away, or they would come move their families to try to make money and try to do something new and different.
그러니까 아예 다르네요. 느낌이 이 역사적으로, 이 문화적으로 다를 수밖에 없는. 네. 이 커머셜 뱅크가 와이오밍 특수목적 예금기관 인가를 보유한 디지털 자산 특화 은행이라고 하는데 이게 전통 은행이랑 비교했을 때 디지털 자산 특화 은행 어떤 차이점이 있는지 궁금합니다.
Biggest difference is that a Wyoming SPDI, like Commercium, only transacts in digital assets, stablecoins, and tokenized assets. That's it. Also, many SPDIs do not loan any money. There are no loans at all. So the other big difference is that SPDIs can do something called bailment custody. That means that all of these digital assets are separated from your digital assets are separated from mine. They do not appear on the balance sheet. So that means that if an SPDI goes bankrupt, you are not affected. You keep your digital assets completely. You don't lose them, even in bankruptcy. So conventional banks have things like credit cards. They have mortgages to buy a house, or they might give a loan to a small business or to a large company. The SPDIs don't do that.
그러면 은행에서 가장 이제 큰 수익 내는 게 이제 론에서 발생하는 걸로 알고 있는데 론을 하지 않으면 은행 수익 구조는 그럼 어떻게 되는 거예요?
By charging a fee on every transaction involving digital assets. That's how they make money. So yes, they can make money if they do all of these other things related to loans, but that also means by not doing loans, they have lower risk because when the economy is bad, people are not able to pay back their loans, and so it creates more risk on the bank.
지금 한국 같은 경우도 이제 스테이블 코인 활성화 법안 이런 걸 준비하고 있더라고요. 지금 기업이라던가 아직은 이게 은행과의 뭐 어떤 거래를 해보지 않은 상황에서 한국은 지금 어떻게 될까에 대해서 좀 많이 긴장하고 있다.
That's understandable, but Korea needs to move faster in terms of allowing stablecoins and other digital assets and promoting them, encouraging them. And in fact, Korea in the past couple of years has created some laws to do that. But maybe, for instance, I was reading recently that Hana Financial created a group, a Korean won-based stablecoin with 4 other financial institutions in Korea. That's a really great start.
지금 저도 그 예전에 그 KBW 때 스테이블 코인으로 해서 메인 스피커로 이렇게 한번 나가서 이야기했었었는데 스테이블 코인 쪽에서 아직까지는 그 두려움이 많이 남아 있다 보니까 이거를 기존 은행이 키를 쥐고 해야 된다. 안정성을 위해서. 아니다. 핀테크 회사의 자유로운 영역이기 때문에 자율성을 줘야 된다. 이 2개 때문에 지금 법안이 통과가 안 되고 있어요. 이게 어떤 게 더 무게를 두는 게 맞는지 좀 생각.
In terms of being able to issue stablecoins, in my opinion, both conventional banks and fintech companies should be able to issue stablecoins, and that is something that also the American Congress was debating, but they passed something called the Genius Act last year, which allowed for the different types of companies to issue stable coins. And so maybe Korea might want to think about looking at how America has done that.
진짜 지금 미국 같은 경우는 스테이블 코인을 얼마나 좀 활용하고 있는지 뭐 예를 들어 정말 기업끼리 거래소도 쓰고 있는 건지 좀 궁금하거든요.
In America, there are 2 main stable coins, right, that are being used, USDC and USDT, but those are used around the world. There are other smaller stable coins that are now beginning to be issued by some banks and some fintech companies. But let me go back to the last question. The reason why I think it's good to allow conventional banks and fintech companies to issue stable coins is it creates competition. As long as there are some laws or regulations regarding the issuance of stable coins and how stable coins are regulated, I think it's good to have different types of companies issuing stable coins.
그러면은 이제 뭐 말씀하셨던 그 디지털 에셋 은행이 이제 스테이블 코인, 이제 뭐 토큰화 자산, 그리고 이제 크립토 커스터디 뭐 이런 걸 이제 다 결합한 이제 완전한 디지털 은행이 이제 이러면은 강점이 이제 뭐고 한국 투자자들은 그러면 여기에 왜 주목을 해야 되는지 좀 이야기를 좀 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
The future of finance and banking is going to be around digital assets. And so a digital bank that starts off that way from the beginning has advantages. It doesn't need to change all of its technology. It doesn't need to change its operations. It starts from the very beginning knowing how to transact in stable coins and digital assets more effectively than a traditional bank.
그럼 지금 미국에는 디지털 이 은행이 좀 얼마나 있고 규모가 얼마나 되는지 좀.
They're very few. And the reason why is that so far it's been very difficult for digital banks to operate as a bank because of the laws and regulations, but that has been changing. So I think in the future we will hopefully see more digital banks in the United States, but right now there are very, very few.
그러면 뭐 아직 뭐 상장한 은행이 있거나 그러진 않겠네요.
Not any American digital banks, no. They have not done any IPOs.
그 해외에는 사례가 있나요?
There was one actually out of Brazil
브라질.
called, I believe it was called Nubank, that actually did an IPO either on NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, probably NASDAQ, but that was a couple of years ago. But they're more of a global digital bank. They're not really focused on the US customers, but they did their IPO in America because that's where they could get the most investment and capital and interest in their IPO.
미국 내에서 이제 앞으로 이 디지털 은행의 성장성이 얼마나 될 건지 한번 좀 전망을 좀 들어볼 수 있을까요?
Well, I think yes, there will be growth in digital banks in America because the laws are starting to become more encouraging. But more importantly, I think that the regular person like you and me has to become comfortable with the idea of using stable coins, using digital assets, and because I think a lot of people still don't know about really much about stable coins or digital assets, so they may not want to, they may feel reluctant to want to deal with a digital bank.
스테이블 코인을 써보니까 장점이 참 많았던 것 같아요. 개인적으로 실제로 뭐 거래할 때도 필요할 것 같고 이제 그런데 다만 이제 나도 쓰고 너도 써야 둘 다 이게 교환이 가능한데 저는 쓰고 저 사람이 안 쓰는 경우가 많다 보니까 그래서 활용하지 못했던 경우가 많았던 것 같은데 어느 순간부터는 한번 활성화가 거래가 늘어나는 구간이 오지 않을까 싶거든요. 그게 언제 어떤 시그널로 이렇게 좀 발생할 거라 보시는 좀 궁금합니다.
I think it's going to start very soon because if you look at investment funds, many of them are starting to be tokenized. Examples include companies like Franklin Templeton, BlackRock, Apollo Asset Management are starting to tokenize their investment funds. In addition, both the NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange have said that they are going to tokenize all of the company's stock on their stock exchanges. So people will have to get used to tokenize a digital asset that represents their stock ownership in big public companies like Google or IBM or General Electric.
그게 이제 요새 많이 들어 RWA라고 이제 들어봤는데 뭐 최근 뭐 이제 뭐 JP 모건 같은 금융기관들도 이제 토큰화된 자산 그 사모펀드에 주목해보자라고 하면서 실물 연계 자산이라고 그러죠. 이게 금융시장에 어떻게 영향을 미칠지 저는 좀 상상이 안 갑니다. 근데 이제 어떻게 좀 상상하시는지 좀 궁금합니다.
As I was mentioning before, other investment funds are also starting to tokenize their investment funds. And so JP Morgan in particular, as the largest commercial bank, that's big news because, some of these other companies I mentioned, people may not know about them. The tokenization of real world assets will also grow. For instance, real estate. There is now more and more commercial real estate, industrial real estate like factories that are starting to become tokenized. That makes it easier to keep track of ownership, to trade ownership in that real estate. There's also been tokenization of things like antiques, collectibles, Pokemon, or other things, actual things that people have are being tokenized now.
RWA에 대해서 아직 뭐 모르는 우리 구독자분들이 워낙 많다 보니까 이걸 뭐 쉽게 생각하면은 건물도 RWA가 되고 뭐 주식도 토큰화가 되고 이렇게 듣고 알고 있는데 실제로 실물을 보관하는 상태로 이렇게 토큰화해서 거래를 하는 건지 있다라고 가상으로 치고 거래만 하는 건지 좀 이게 궁금하거든요.
You have an actual thing, as I mentioned, for instance, let's say a tall office building that's being tokenized. That means that instead of having a piece of paper that says you own part of that office building, you have a digital asset that says that you own part of that office building. So that's how real world tokenization works. You have both, there's an actual physical thing, and then there's a digital asset representing ownership in that thing.
정말 지금 이렇게 얘기 나누는데 10년 뒤쯤이면 이게 현실화돼서 1년 뒤쯤 되면 현실화돼서 정말 거래가 되는 거를 보게 될 것 같은데 그러면 RWA 거래 주도권을 기존에 이제 은행들이 가져갈 건지 뭐 새로운 거래소가 생긴다 생각하시는지 좀 이게 궁금하거든요.
If you talk about RWA of things like art, antiques, collectibles, there may not be a lot of tokenization of those because let's say that I own one piece of a piece of artwork, a painting. Well, unless that artwork becomes very valuable, then why would I want to own that through the tokenization of a real world asset, a piece of art? So I don't necessarily know if RWA tokenization is going to grow really big.
자, 그러면은 이 디지털 자산 은행이 미국에서도 이제 뭐 확대가 되려면은 이 제도적인 허들이 있을 거라 생각하는데, 그러면 이 허들을 넘고 나면 얼마나 기회가 생긴다 보시는지 좀 궁금합니다.
I think there will need to be, companies will need to lobby their lawmakers to pass laws that allow for digital assets, that allow for tokenization, that allow for digital banks, that allow for all of these things. Because unless there is a favorable legal environment, businesses, companies are going to be very hesitant to start working on all of these different parts of digital assets.
아, 이 단어 제가 왜 웃었냐면 미국은 합법이잖아요, 로비가. 왜 한국은 로비가 합법이 아니다 보니까.
I'm sure it is. At least in America, there are professional lobbyists. Are there professional lobbyists in Korea?
음지에서 활동합니다.
Exactly. But I think what can happen is that once Korean lawmakers see other countries, leapfrogging them in terms of digital assets, in terms of digital banks, in terms of stable coins, use of stable coins, then I think that Korea will want to catch up and will want to be on the same level because Korea has been very good about doing that in other parts of the economy.
미국 내에서는 로비가 이제 합법인 이유가 궁금합니다. 예를 들어 이 돈이 그러면은 그 미국 의원 개인 주머니로 들어가는 시스템이 아니라는 거죠.
It's supposed to go into their political campaign fund so they can use it to become re-elected.
그러면 이게 말만 로비지 실제로 로비는 아니지.
Well, then that's bribery.
아, 그러니까 뇌물과 로비는 다른 거구나.
They should be.
미국도 뇌물에서는 처벌이 되게 강한가요?
There are a few strong lobbying groups concerning cryptocurrency and digital assets. And so, they've been trying to educate the lawmakers about the benefits of using cryptocurrency and digital assets and passing laws that allow them.
아, 그러면 이 로비라는 게 그 로비스트를 통해서 돈을 주고 이제 의원을 만나게 하고 캠페인에 돈을 넣어준 다음에 내가 이런 뭐 디지털 에셋의 이런 정책이 이런 긍정적인 효과가 있습니다라고 의원을 설득해서 표를 하나씩 이제 긍정적인 표로 바꿔나가는 과정이 미국의 로비라는 거네요.
Generally, but the idea is to get the lawmakers to introduce laws, support what the lobbyist has encouraged the lawmaker to do, whatever it may be. But in this case, stable coins and cryptocurrency, digital assets.
미국 보면은 핀테크가 참 잘 발달한 것 같아요. 근데 이제 한국 같은 경우는 기존 은행 시스템이 너무 좋아서 핀테크가 많이 발전을 못 하는데 미국 같은 경우는 은행 시스템이 잘 돼 있으면서도 핀테크도 잘 돼 있단 말이죠. 왜 핀테크가 잘 되는지 이유를 좀 들어볼 수 있을까요?
I think it's the idea of allowing competition in the financial system. So that is why you see different kinds of companies, conventional banks and fintech companies in the financial system. And so fintech companies are, they're starting to compete with conventional banks and pushing the conventional banks to do things differently and to change.
미국은 은행들도 다 민간 은행들이고 정부가 이 규제를 은행에 대해서 세게 하지는 않는 시스템이잖아요. 이게 효과가 있다라는 거죠.
Yes.
이게 한국 같은 경우는 민간 은행이라고 하지만 그 정부의 입김과 규제의 영향을 많이 받았거든요. 뭐 금리조차도 너네 이익을 왜 이렇게 많이 내라고 하면서 이익 줄여라고 하면 이익을 줄여야 되는 게 한국의 은행들이다 보니까 이제 경쟁보다는 뭔가 좀 약간 이 정부의 영향을 많이 받는 느낌인데 이게 어떻게 보면은 금융의 어떤 경쟁 발전에 저해가 되는 요소가 될 수도 있겠네요.
Yes. So the entire system in America is more set up to promote competition. And so that's, for instance, why there are laws against monopolies, against against fixing prices. And so, the government tries to stay out of that because, the government tries to promote more of a free market system, allows for different types of companies to compete. Let me add one thing. So if you look at the history of Korea after the Korean War and the way that the government kind of really allowed for the chaebol to develop and favored big companies, big conglomerates, that is why the system is the way that it is in Korea. So it might be slowly changing, but it takes time to change that system.
미국의 은행들이 어떻게 보면은 지금 세계 금융을 이렇게 다 영향을 끼치고 있잖아요. 넘버원이 됐잖아요. 그러면 미국의 금융이 전 세계를 어떻게 보면 이렇게 영향을 끼칠 수 있었던 비결이 뭐라고 보시는지 궁금하거든요.
Again, I think it has to do with kind of a much more open system of banking in America. Yes, there are a lot of regulations that banks have to follow, but banks are largely allowed to operate in a pretty open and free way. So I think that is why. In addition, I think another reason why U.S. banks have become so strong around the world is because of the general strength historically of the U.S. economy, the U.S. economy being very strong, and the influence of the U.S. dollar, which some people have said that maybe that power of the U.S. dollar is starting to decline a little bit.
그럼 이제 실리콘밸리 부분에 대해서 좀 여쭤보고 싶은데 제가 실리콘밸리를 이제 세 번째 오고 여기서 느꼈던 거 하나는 좋은 아이디어만 있으면 투자가 충분히 이루어진다라는 생각을 좀 보고서는 이게 좀 충격을 먹었었어요. 그러니까 미국이 가장 강한 강점이 금융이었었고 여기에 이제 테크라는 게 붙으면서 이 실리콘밸리 발전에 금융이 많은 영향을 끼쳤다 생각하는데 이제 좀 얼마나 영향을 끼쳤는지라고 생각하시는지 좀 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
It's a combination of things. It's a combination of just the idea of taking risk. It's the idea of, it's all of the money, venture capital money around here. But the universities here, Stanford and Berkeley, have played a very big role because they've encouraged innovation. Those universities, the students and professors at those universities have also created a lot of inventions in all different areas. And I think that those are all of the reasons why it's a unique mixture that made Silicon Valley the way that it is.
예를 들어 이 스타트업 같은 경우는 개인 관점에선 담보할 수 있는 게 없잖아요. 망하면은 그냥 손실인데 그럼에도 불구하고 이제 금융권이 이렇게 투자를 해주는 건 어떤 무엇을 담보로 생각하고 이렇게 넣어주는지 좀 궁금하거든요.
Again, it's the idea of taking a risk on a new company and hoping that some of them will become very successful and that there will be a big return on investment. In addition, they realize that they will lose money on most of their investments in startups, but they only need a couple to become very successful.
한국은 이 스타트업 중에서 성공을 하더라도 우리말로 이제 여기 기준으로 빌리언 달러 이런 기업들이 잘 안 나오는데 여기는 이제 빌리언 규모가 이제 쉽게 나오다 보니까 투자 성공률이 좋은 거네요.
Yes, that's a large part of the reason.
그러면 이제 25년 동안 또 이제 실리콘밸리 이제 기업들도 많이 지원하시고 이렇게 해오셨는데 어제도 제가 보니까 이제 한국의 이제 창업자들이 이렇게 또 꿈을 안고 이렇게 왔더라고요. 글로벌 창업자가 되고 싶다면 어떤 것들을 좀 준비해야 된다, 좀 조언을 해주실 게 어떤 것들이 있는지 좀 궁금합니다.
A couple of things. One is understand the Silicon Valley culture, the way that it works. Secondly, start to know people, develop connections, a network in Silicon Valley, whether it's with other startup founders or with investors or other people in the startup space. And third, if you're serious about being here in Silicon Valley, you need to figure out what kind of legal structure you want to have. Do you want to have just a subsidiary of a Korean company, an American subsidiary in America of a Korean company, or do you want to just have a completely separate American company that's unrelated to anything in Korea?
한국 창업자들이 저기 미국에 창업하고 싶은데 조언해달라 아니면 법률적으로 자문해달라 이렇게 좀 맡아보셨었는지 좀 궁금하거든요.
Yes, I've worked with and I've taught Korean entrepreneurs who have come from Korea to Silicon Valley.
가장 많이 하는 실수들이 있잖아요. 여기 와서 이렇게 법률적으로 이렇게 준비 안 된 실수도 어떤 것들이 좀 있었는지.
Well, I think Korean entrepreneurs want everything to be perfect before they start, before they put their product out there. There is a saying in the startup community, fail fast and fail often. Why? Because that's how you learn. That's how you get better. That's how your startup, that's how your product, that's how your people get better. That's how you understand your customers better.
어제 또 하나 지적 중에 하나가 뭐냐면 미국에 있는 창업자들은 파이팅 넘치고 말을 되게 자신감 있게 표현을 하는데 이제 코리아 창업자들은 샤이하다라고 이제 했었던 건데 그것도 좀 영향이 있다 보시는지 좀 궁금하거든요.
Yes, I think in general that is accurate description of Korean entrepreneurs and American entrepreneurs. I think again that goes in part to this idea that Koreans don't like failing. They don't like failing. They want everything to work. They want to be perfect, and that's in part because of that's how they grew up.
한국 같은 경우는 한 번 실패하면은 꼬리표가 붙으면서 이 사람이 다시 창업하기가 쉽지 않은 문화였었던 것 같은데 미국 같은 경우는 실패해도 다시 창업하는데 투자가 또 되고 론이 나오고 이런 게 가능한 문화라는 거죠.
Yes, absolutely. That is accurate.
이 문화가 다르다는 거를 이해하고 여기에 접근하지 않으면 아까 말씀하신 대로 회사의 이제 경영 전략부터 모든 게 다 달라질 수밖에 없어요.
Yes, because also I think, as I said before, Korean entrepreneurs often want things to be perfect. And so that also may cause a reluctance to change if things don't work out. They may want to stay on the same path and just say, oh, well, we thought this is really good. We did these things and we thought about it. And so let's just go. One more thing here. In Korea, as you know, in the school education system, and getting into college, for example, is based on a test. The higher your test score, the more closer you are to perfect, the better university you will get into.
Yes.
It's not quite like that in America. There are a lot of other factors, for instance, that universities look at in deciding which students to admit. So I think that is part of the reason why the Korean educational system is part of the reason why Korean entrepreneurs really want to make things perfect before they go out and launch their company, launch their product.
지금 오늘 좀 얘기를 하면서 들어보니까 이게 이제 베이스 자체가 많이 다른 상황이네요. 그러니까 금융도 다르고 교육도 다르고 이제 문화도 다르고 이제 그런 상황에서 트렌드를 따라잡으려고 제도를 만들다 보니까 아무리 제도는 똑같다 하더라도 베이스가 다르다 보니까 해석이 다르고 이런 차이가 벌어질 수 있었던 이 핵심이 아닌가라도 좀 생각이 좀 듭니다.
It's all of those factors combined.
그래서 한국 사람 입장으로서 조언을 구하자면 한국이 이제 앞으로 이제 어쨌든 창업자들이 많아지고 금융이 강해져야 다음 먹거리가 나올 거라 보는데 대한민국 미래가 이제 테크랑 파이낸스라고 보고 있는데 잘 되려면은 어떻게 해야 된다 좀 조언이 좀 필요할 것 같습니다.
Korea can do it. And as you know, the Korean government is really encouraging it. For instance, there was this recent initiative called Startup for All, where the Korean government chose 20 accelerators and incubators to help develop Korean entrepreneurs and startups. That is a great step in the right direction. And I think Korea has, even more than the United States, has a global perspective. And I think as long as it continues to have that, then it can be successful in the entrepreneurial and startup space.
그래서 한국에 대한 애정과 사랑이 느껴지는 인터뷰라서 오늘 좀 더 감동이 좀 깊게 왔습니다.
Yeah,
Thank you
I
so much for
mean,
today's interview.
just to let you know, my parents came from Korea, and they were both very well educated. I was lucky in that
Yeah.
sense, and they encouraged me to do well in school. But they ultimately learned that being successful in America is not just about doing well in school. I was lucky because I did well in school and I went to some very great universities. But I think it's important for Koreans to think about themselves in a much more well-rounded way. And Koreans can do it. They can. It's just, again, I think there's some sense of shame when you fail. And I felt that way for a long time too. I mean, there are things that I cannot do very well. There are things that I tried that didn't work. But I've kind of learned that it's okay. It's okay if I fail. And, a lot of people that I know, a lot of entrepreneurs, they try something, it doesn't work. Their startup may completely fail and go under, but then they get up and either say, I'm going to do something new or do it differently next time. Or they might even say, okay, maybe this startup thing is not really for me. And then they go back to, a company. But that's okay too. But they've gained a lot from having that experience. So that's what I'm a believer in. And then I just want to encourage Koreans to do that. And yes, I don't speak Korean very well, but I'm proud to be Korean. And that's why I want to, help Korean entrepreneurs become successful. More Korean entrepreneurs become successful. My brother lives in Korea, even though he also grew up in America like me, and he really likes it in Korea. He loves it there. I've only gotten to visit Korea twice in my entire life, but I do plan on visiting more often.
앞으로도 많은 활동 기대하도록 하겠습니다.
Yes, I look forward to.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.